Teachers, what was the best smart A's response you've heard from a student? Story 1. In 5th grade, my teacher ran weekly spelling bees like they were some sort of Ivy League entrance exam. One Friday, she called on me to spell bureaucracy, a word I'd never heard before in my life. I stood there, sweating bullets while the entire class waited. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, Bureau. Can I buy a vowel? The class erupted into laughter so loud you'd think someone had just won the lottery. Even the teacher couldn't hide her smirk before snapping back into serious mode. "This isn't a game show, young man," she said, glaring at me. I shrugged and replied, "Well, it sure feels like one." She sighed, waved me off, and moved on to the next person. I didn't win that day, but I like to think I earned a moral victory. Story 2. My high school chemistry teacher, Mr. Bryant, had a no-phones rule that he enforced like a drill sergeant. If he caught you texting, he'd stop the entire class to lecture you in front of everyone. One day, he spotted me sneaking a quick message under the desk. "Care to share with the class what's so important?" he barked. Without missing a beat, I said, "Sure. My mom wants to know what we're having for dinner." That was apparently the wrong answer, because the class immediately started throwing out meal ideas. Pizza, tacos, burgers. Someone even yelled, "Lobster!" Mr. Bryant rolled his eyes and muttered, "Fine, tacos," before trying to restore order. I kept my phone in my bag after that, not because I was scared, but because I didn't want to hear any more food debates during chemistry. Story 3. During my junior year, we had this substitute teacher, Mrs. Calloway, who took everything way too seriously. I was doodling in the margins of my notebook during a boring math lesson when she stormed over. "Art is not going to get you anywhere in life," she announced, loud enough for the whole class to hear. I looked up at her, trying to keep a straight face, and said, "Tell that to the person who designed the chair you're sitting on." The class burst out laughing, and Mrs. Calloway turned bright red. She muttered something about disrespect before walking back to the front of the room. The best part? One of my classmates whispered, "I bet her chair's from IKEA," which sent everyone into silent giggles for the rest of the period. Mrs. Calloway never subbed for us again. Story 4. My history teacher, Mr. Edwards, had a habit of complaining about kids these days, not knowing anything about the past. One day, he was on a roll, going on about how history is the key to understanding the present. He ended his rant by slamming his hand on the desk and asking, "Who can tell me who fought in the Revolutionary War?" The room was dead silent, so I raised my hand, determined to break the tension. "The Americans and the dinosaurs." The entire class lost it. Mr. Edwards just stared at me like I had personally insulted George Washington. "Well, at least you tried," he said, shaking his head. But from that day on, whenever he got too preachy, someone would whisper, "Don't forget the dinosaurs," and the whole class would start laughing. Story 5. In middle school, we had a strict dress code, and my math teacher, Mrs. Tate, loved enforcing it. One day, she stopped me in the hallway to scold me about my hoodie. "Hoodies are not allowed," she said, her voice dripping with authority. I shrugged and replied, "It's not a hoodie, it's a cape of invisibility. That's why you didn't see me until now." She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "This isn't Hogwarts," she snapped, clearly unimpressed. "And you're not invisible." I grinned and said, "Well, I guess it's not working then." The entire hallway started laughing, and she stormed off, muttering about disrespectful kids. Edit. Turns out, Mrs. Tate complained to the principal about me mocking her authority. The principal called me into his office, but couldn't keep a straight face when I explained the invisibility cape joke. He told me to watch the sarcasm, and sent me back to class. Mrs. Tate avoided me for the rest of the semester. Story 6. In 8th grade, my science teacher, Mrs. Clark, had this obsession with discipline. She once stopped mid-lecture because I was yawning and called me out in front of the whole class. "Am I boring you?" she asked, clearly expecting me to apologize. Without missing a beat, I said, "No, ma'am, just oxygenating my brain so I can keep up with this riveting lecture." The room went completely silent for a second, then erupted in laughter. Mrs. Clark turned bright red and mumbled something about respect before continuing. But for the rest of the week, every time someone yawned in class, they'd over-explain that they were just oxygenating their brain. She never brought it up again. Story 7. Our gym teacher, Coach Miller, was notorious for his sarcastic pep talks. One day, he announced we were running laps because everyone here needs to work on their stamina. I groaned and said, "Coach, if I wanted to run, I'd have joined track, not signed up for dodgeball." He smirked and replied, "You can thank me later when you're not wheezing after 2 steps." To which I said, "You act like I'm planning to run a marathon. I'm just trying to survive dodgeballs." The class laughed, and Coach Miller rolled his eyes, but let us take a water break before starting the laps. Small victories. Story 8. In high school, my English teacher, Mrs. Adams, asked us to write essays about our life goals. I wrote a completely over-the-top piece about how I planned to become a secret agent, detailing fake missions and classified adventures. When she handed back our essays, she had this amused look on her face and said, "Interesting. You do know this is supposed to be serious, right?" I shrugged and replied, "Well, Mrs. Adams, my life is a classified mission. I couldn't reveal too much." The class laughed and she shook her head, muttering, "At least you're creative." I ended up getting a B, but she added a note at the bottom. "Next time, try being a little less mysterious." Story 9. Mr. Harper, my biology teacher, loved catching students who weren't paying attention. One day, he noticed me staring out the window during a lecture on ecosystems and called me out. "Care to share what's so fascinating outside?" he asked, clearly annoyed. I turned back and said, "I was just observing the local wildlife, Mr. Harper. Isn't that part of the lesson?" The class chuckled, and he gave me a long, exasperated look before saying, "Fine, why don't you write a report on what you observed?" So I did. I turned in a detailed, sarcastic essay about squirrels engaging in territorial disputes and birds debating the merits of different tree branches. He handed it back with a smile and a note that read, "Clever, but next time, pay attention." Story 10. My high school principal, Mr. Thompson, was one of those guys who loved giving long motivational speeches during assemblies. One day, he asked for student volunteers to share their thoughts on leadership. My friends dared me to go up, so I did. I grabbed the mic and said, "Leadership is like being the captain of a sinking ship. You don't know who caused the hole, but somehow it's your job to fix it and keep everyone calm while they panic." The gym was dead silent for a second before bursting into laughter. Even Mr. Thompson cracked a smile, though he quickly said, "Well, that's an interesting perspective." Edit. Later that day, he called me into his office. I thought I was in trouble, but instead, he asked me to join the student council, saying my honest outlook was refreshing. So, I guess roasting leadership landed me a leadership role. Go figure. Story 11. In 10th grade, my math teacher, Mr. Reynolds, was known for his impossible pop quizzes. One day, he handed us a quiz so hard, you'd think it was written by a NASA engineer. Halfway through, I gave up and wrote, "I don't know the answer, but I do know that every problem has a solution. Maybe you could teach me how to find this one." Mr. Reynolds read it out loud to the class, chuckling, and said, "At least someone here has a sense of humor." He didn't give me points, but he did use my answer as an example of what out-of-the-box thinking looks like. I guess that's a win, sort of. Story 12. Our literature teacher, Mrs. Chambers, loved assigning poetry analysis. One day, she asked us to interpret a particularly confusing poem. When she called on me, I said, "It's about a guy who's overthinking everything, kind of like how we're overthinking this poem." The class laughed, but Mrs. Chambers looked unimpressed. "That's an interesting take," she said, frowning. Then I added, "But if you want the real meaning, I think it's just about a guy waiting for his coffee to kick in." She sighed and said, "Next time, maybe dig a little deeper." The kicker? The next day, she confessed that my second interpretation wasn't far off. I'm still waiting for that apology. Story 13. My economics teacher, Mr. Daniels, had a habit of giving life lessons, disguised as lectures. One day, he was going on about how hard work always pays off, and I couldn't resist raising my hand. "Does that include lottery winners?" I asked innocently. The class erupted into laughter, and he gave me this withering look before replying. "Luck is not a financial strategy." I followed up with, "Then why does everyone in the staff room buy lottery tickets?" The room exploded again, and Mr. Daniels just shook his head, saying, "Let's get back to supply and demand." I never got a real answer, but I like to think I made a point. Story 14. In 7th grade, we had this weirdly competitive PE teacher, Coach Davis. One day, he challenged the entire class to beat him in a push-up contest. When it was my turn, I did one push-up, sat back and said, "I think I'll save my energy for something important, like walking home." The whole class cracked up, and Coach Davis rolled his eyes, saying, "Some people don't know the meaning of hard work." I shrugged and said, "Some people don't know the meaning of a break." From then on, he stopped asking me to compete in anything. Honestly, I think we both won that day. Story 15. Mrs. Tate, my art teacher, had a thing for constructive criticism. One day, she looked at my painting and said, "It's interesting, but maybe next time try using a little more imagination." I looked at her and said, "I thought art was supposed to reflect the soul. Are you saying my soul needs more imagination?" The class laughed, and she gave me this tight-lipped smile before replying, "Art also reflects effort." I smirked and said, "Effort is subjective, isn't it?" She sighed and moved on. Edit. Later that week, Mrs. Tate pulled me aside and said, "You're talented, but you can't argue your way into good art. Try putting as much effort into the work as you do into your comebacks." Fair enough. My next painting got displayed in the hallway, so I guess we both had a point. Story 16. In 8th grade, our geography teacher, Mr. Walton, was obsessed with maps and trivia. One day, he asked the class, "Who can tell me the capital of Mongolia?" Silence filled the room. When he called on me, I said, "Well, it's Ulaanbaatar, unless they've changed it recently, in which case I'd like to phone a friend." The class cracked up, and Mr. Walton smirked. "That's correct, but next time drop the game show theatrics." I couldn't resist adding, "Well, you're the one giving us trivia questions." He sighed, but let it go. After that, every geography question became a race to see who could yell, "Final answer," first. Story 17. In high school, we had this substitute teacher, Mr. Evans, who didn't know our names and barely managed to control the class. At one point, he got fed up and said, "If you think this is funny, why don't you come up here and teach?" I raised my hand and said, "Sure, what's the topic?" He looked surprised but said, "Go ahead." I went up to the board, wrote "Why substitute teachers should chill," and started listing reasons. The class lost it, and Mr. Evans tried to look mad, but ended up laughing too. By the end of the day, he called me his co-teacher and made me pass out papers. Not bad for a smart remark. Story 18. Our biology teacher, Miss Parker, loved asking trick questions to keep us on our toes. One day, she asked, "What's the largest organ in the human body?" Everyone was guessing random internal organs, but I confidently said, "The skin." She gave me a surprised look and said, "That's correct, but how did you know?" I shrugged and replied, "My mom watches a lot of medical dramas." The whole class laughed, and Miss Parker said, "Well, tell your mom she's helping you ace biology." From then on, every time I got a question right, someone would joke, "Must have been on Grey's Anatomy." Story 19. In middle school, we had this librarian, Mrs. Carter, who enforced silence like her life depended on it. One day, she caught me whispering to my friend and marched over. "Do you think the library is a place for conversation?" she snapped. I looked at her and said, "Well, technically, we're discussing literature." She stared at me for a moment, then said, "Discuss it somewhere else," before walking away. My friend whispered, "Smooth move," and we both struggled not to laugh. After that, she'd glare at me every time I even looked like I might speak. Story 20. my physics teacher, Mr. Grayson, was explaining Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. He asked the class for a real-life example, and I raised my hand. When my mom nags me to clean my room, and I accidentally clean the wrong part of the house, that's the opposite reaction, right? The class burst out laughing, and even Mr. Grayson cracked a smile. Creative, he said. But maybe next time, think of a less personal example. Edit. The next day, he actually brought up my example again and said, as funny as it was, it actually fits the concept. He gave me extra credit for thinking outside the box. But now everyone calls me Newton at home. Thanks, Mr. Grayson. Story 21. In 6th grade, my history teacher, Mr. Allen, had a rule that you couldn't leave the classroom for any reason during a test. One day, I really needed to use the bathroom during a quiz. I raised my hand and asked, and he said, "What's more important, your test or your bladder?" Without skipping a beat, I said, "Well, sir, I can retake the test, but I don't think you'll clean the chair if I stay." The class erupted in laughter while Mr. Allen turned bright red. He reluctantly waved me out the door, muttering something about kids these days. When I got back, someone had written, "Bladder 1, Test 0 on the board. Mr. Allen wasn't amused, but the rest of us were. Story 22. My English teacher, Mrs. Hart, had a love-hate relationship with group projects. One day, she assigned us to rewrite a Shakespearean scene in modern language. Our group turned Romeo and Juliet into a reality dating show, complete with terrible puns. When it was our turn to present, I played Romeo and said, "Juliet, you're the avocado to my toast, the Wi-Fi to my phone." The class howled with laughter, but Mrs. Hart wasn't impressed. "This isn't a comedy," she said. I grinned and replied, "Neither was their relationship, but here we are." She sighed and gave us a B for creativity. Story 23. Our chemistry teacher, Mr. Burke, was explaining a complex reaction when he noticed me staring at my desk, completely zoned out. He called on me and said, "Maybe you'd like to explain this reaction, since you seem so deep in thought?" I looked up and said, "Actually, I was wondering why water is tasteless, but has a taste when you drink it." The class went silent, and Mr. Burke blinked like his brain had short-circuited. Then he said, "Well, that's not what I asked, but an interesting thought. Now, back to chemistry." For weeks after, classmates would randomly whisper, "What does water taste like?" whenever he was around. Story 24. In gym class, Coach Rogers had us running laps when a classmate tripped and fell. While helping him up, I joked, "Gravity's undefeated." Coach Rogers overheard and said, "You think you're funny? Why don't you explain gravity to the class?" So I turned to everyone and said, "Gravity is like Coach's whistle. It's always there, whether you like it or not." The class burst into laughter, and Coach Rogers actually laughed too, though he quickly said, "All right, comedian, get back to running." By the end of the period, everyone was joking about Coach's law of gravity. Story 25. Mrs. Green, our math teacher, loved word problems and would always add ridiculous scenarios to them. One day, she asked, "If Sarah has 12 apples and gives away 5, how many does she have left?" I raised my hand and said, "Depends. Is Sarah running a business, or is she just bad at sharing?" The class cracked up, and Mrs. Green gave me one of her signature glares. "Let's try to stay serious," she said. I smirked and added, "Serious question. Why does Sarah have so many apples?" Eat it. A week later, Mrs. Green assigned a problem that started, "If Sarah owns an apple farm." She smirked as she handed it out and said, "This one's for you." I guess even teachers have a sense of humor sometimes. Story 26. In 9th grade, my biology teacher, Mr. Clark, was lecturing about animal adaptations. He asked, "What's an example of a species adapting to its environment?" Everyone was silent, so he called on me. I said, "Cats. They've adapted to make humans do all the hunting for them, except now it's in grocery stores." The class burst out laughing, and Mr. Clark rolled his eyes. "That's not exactly what I meant," he said, but I could tell he was holding back a smile. Later, he jokingly added, "I suppose cats really are excellent manipulators of their environment." Story 27. Mrs. Bennet, our literature teacher, was big on dramatic readings. One day, she called on me to read a monologue from Macbeth. I decided to really get into character, using an exaggerated British accent and flailing my arms like I was auditioning for a soap opera. The class was in stitches, but Mrs. Bennet just stared at me. "Are you done?" she asked. "Not quite," I said, then added, "Methinks I deserve an Oscar." She sighed and said, "Well, you've earned my pity." Edit. A week later, she handed me a note after class that read, "For someone who jokes so much, you actually have potential in drama. Ever considered the school play?" I didn't join, but I think she was serious. Story 28. My history teacher, Mr. Graham, had a rule. No late assignments unless you had a valid excuse. One time I forgot to turn in my essay and decided to wing it. When he asked why it was late, I said, "I was doing field research on procrastination." The class laughed, and Mr. Graham gave me this unimpressed look. "Interesting. And what were your findings?" he asked sarcastically. "That it doesn't work out very well," I replied. He handed me a late penalty slip, but added, "At least you're honest." Story 29. In 7th grade, our art teacher, Mrs. Lewis, gave us an assignment to paint something that represented freedom. I painted an empty desk with a broken clock on it. When she asked me to explain, I said, "It's about the freedom from homework and time limits." The class laughed, but Mrs. Lewis wasn't amused. "Freedom should be something meaningful," she said. I replied, "Have you ever had 3 assignments due on the same day? This is very meaningful." She sighed and gave me a B for creative but cynical interpretation. Story 30. Mr. Reed, my physics teacher, was giving a lecture on energy conservation and asked, "Can anyone explain why conserving energy is important?" I raised my hand and said, "Because if we run out of energy, we'll all end up living like it's the 1800s, and I'm not churning butter." The class burst out laughing, but Mr. Reed gave me a serious look. "So, you'd conserve energy for selfish reasons?" he asked. "Exactly," I said. "I think we call that survival instinct." He chuckled and said, "Well, at least you're honest." Edit. Later, he pulled me aside and said, "You know, you'd be great at explaining these concepts if you weren't always trying to make a joke out of everything." I told him, "Humor's just my way of conserving energy." He laughed, but I could tell he was half serious. Story 31. In 11th grade, my chemistry teacher, Dr. Patel, was explaining covalent bonds in excruciating detail. After about 15 minutes of non-stop talking, she paused and asked, "Does anyone have any questions?" I raised my hand and said, "Yeah, can covalent bonds explain why my motivation and I can't seem to stay connected?" The class erupted in laughter, but Dr. Patel wasn't having it. She shot me a look and said, "Maybe if you understood the concept better, your motivation would stick." Fair enough. But the next week, when she asked for another example of bonding, a friend whispered, "Don't say motivation again." And we both nearly got sent out for laughing. Story 32. Our gym teacher, Coach Wilson, was famous for giving the same motivational speech every year. No pain, no gain. One day, he was pushing us to run extra laps, and I blurted out, "What if I'm okay with no gain? Can I also have no pain?" The class broke into laughter, and Coach Wilson just stared at me for a moment before saying, "You know what? If you walk the rest of the laps, it's no pain and no gain. But don't complain if you lose at dodgeball later." I took him up on it and happily strolled the rest of the way. By the end of class, everyone was joking about adopting my no-gain strategy. Story 33. My literature teacher, Mr. Andrews, was a fan of pop quizzes. One day, he handed us one on The Great Gatsby and asked, "What is the green light a symbol for?" I had no idea, so I wrote, "It's probably just a really fancy streetlight." When he handed back the papers, he'd written in red pen, "Your sarcasm is noted. See me after class." Nervous, I went up to him, but instead of scolding me, he said, "You're witty, but you need to channel that into real analysis." I tried to argue that my answer had some merit, and he actually laughed. "Fine," he said. "Next time, back up your sarcasm with evidence." I guess that was his way of saying, do better. Story 34. Mrs. Carter, our history teacher, loved assigning presentations. One time, she asked us to explain a major historical event in 60 seconds. I picked the Boston Tea Party and started my presentation with, basically, it was the original Karen moment. A group of guys got mad about taxes and threw tea into the ocean like it was customer service's fault. The class laughed so hard she had to wait for everyone to calm down. When she finally spoke, she said, creative, but maybe try a little less modern slang next time. I got an A, but I'm pretty sure it's because she secretly loved it. Story 35. In 9th grade, we had a geography teacher, Mr. Barnes, who was obsessed with world capitals. One day he asked me, "What's the capital of Canada?" I froze for a second, then said, "Toronto?" He gave me the most disappointed look and said, "No, it's Ottawa. Did you study at all?" I replied, "I thought Toronto was the capital of vibes." The class erupted, and even Mr. Barnes had to cover his mouth to hide a laugh. Edit. The next week, during a review session, he called on me and said, "So, what's the capital of vibes?" I grinned and said, "Still Toronto." He shook his head but added, "At least you won't forget Ottawa this time." I didn't, and now it's permanently burned into my memory. Story 36. In 10th grade, my math teacher, Mr. Logan, had a habit of throwing trick questions into our quizzes just to mess with us. One day, he gave us a problem that started with, "If a train leaves Chicago at 60 miles per hour." Before he even finished reading it, I raised my hand and asked, "Is it Amtrak? Because then we should factor in delays." The entire class burst out laughing, and Mr. Logan just stared at me, struggling not to smile. "Do you want to solve the problem or write a complaint letter?" he finally said. I shrugged and replied, "Both, honestly." He gave me half credit just for the laugh. Story 37. Mrs. Campbell, our drama teacher, was big on improvisation. One day, she gave us a scene where we were supposed to play stranded travelers. When it was my turn, I pretended to pull out my phone and said, "Relax, guys, I'll just order an Uber." The class cracked up, but Mrs. Campbell looked unimpressed. "You're supposed to be stranded," she said. I grinned and replied, "I'm improvising modern solutions." She sighed and said, "Fine, but next time, commit to the struggle." By the end of class, half the group was joking about hitchhiking instead. Story 38. In middle school, we had this strict librarian, Mrs. Winters, who enforced total silence. One day, she caught me whispering to my friend and said, "Do I need to remind you what a library is for?" I looked at her and said, "To explore the infinite worlds of knowledge." Quietly, of course. The class nearby overheard and started giggling, but Mrs. Winters just raised an eyebrow. "You're very clever. Now let's see if you can whisper as quietly as your wit." After that, she'd occasionally check in with me by saying, "Any infinite worlds discovered today?" Story 39. My history teacher, Mr. Davis, loved hypothetical questions. One day he asked, "If you could meet any historical figure, who would it be and why?" When he got to me, I said, "Probably whoever invented the snooze button. I have questions." The class laughed, and Mr. Davis smirked. "That's not exactly a historical figure," he said, "but I suppose it counts if you're passionate about it." I shrugged and said, "Passion gets me up in the morning." Eventually. He just shook his head and moved on, but I noticed he never asked me another hypothetical. Story 40. In 11th grade, we had a substitute teacher, Mr. Harris, who clearly wasn't used to high schoolers. He handed out worksheets and said, "I expect total silence until everyone is finished." About 10 minutes in, he caught me doodling instead of working. "Is that part of the assignment?" he asked. I looked at him and said, "It's interpretive math." The class burst out laughing, and Mr. Harris gave me a long look before saying, "Then you can interpret the grade I'm giving you." Edit. The next day, our regular teacher, Mrs. Grant, pulled me aside and said, "So, Mr. Harris left a note about your interpretive math. Care to explain?" I told her it was a joke, and she laughed before saying, "Well, he didn't appreciate it, but I do." Just make sure you actually do the work next time. Fair enough. Story 41. In 8th grade, my science teacher, Mrs. Jordan, was explaining Newton's laws when she asked, "Who can give me a real-life example of inertia?" I raised my hand and said, "When my dog refuses to move off the couch no matter how much I try to pull him." The class burst out laughing, and Mrs. Jordan smirked. "Well, that's one way to look at it," she said. Then she added, "But doesn't that mean you're exerting force on the dog?" I replied, "Yes, but his resistance is so strong, it's basically a law of nature." She gave me a B+ for participation, but I think my dog deserved extra credit. Story 42. In high school, we had this substitute teacher, Mr. Conrad, who was trying way too hard to be cool. He said, "Let's make learning fun today," and handed out crossword puzzles instead of a real assignment. As I worked through mine, I noticed half the clues didn't make sense. When he asked how we liked the activity, I raised my hand and said, "It's fun, but I think some of the answers are from an alternate reality." The class laughed, and Mr. Conrad looked confused. Later, he admitted he downloaded the puzzle from a random website without checking it. The rest of the period turned into a competition to find the weirdest answers. Edit. The next day, our regular teacher, Miss Porter, came back and said, "I heard about your alternate reality crossword. Maybe I should have left better instructions." Mr. Conrad never subbed for us again. Story 43. Mrs. Thompson, our English teacher, was going on about the importance of symbolism in literature. She held up a copy of the Scarlet Letter and asked, "What does the A symbolize?" I raised my hand and said, "Accountability." She smiled and said, "Not quite. Anyone else?" After a few wrong guesses, I added, "Or maybe a really strict dress code." The class erupted in laughter, and Mrs. Thompson gave me her trademark, "I can't believe you look." "If Hawthorne were here, he'd be shaking his head," she said. I grinned and replied, "Maybe, but he'd probably be laughing too." Story 44. In gym class, Coach Larson set up a volleyball game and told us to give 110%. I muttered to my friend, "Math doesn't work like that." Coach overheard and said, "What was that, Einstein?" I replied, "Just saying, if we're giving 110%, we should at least get extra credit." The class cracked up, and Coach Larson said, "All right, smart guy, let's see if you can serve with that extra credit." I missed the serve entirely, and he said, "That's about 10% effort right there." The class never let me live it down. Story 45. In history class, Mr. Benson was lecturing about the Cold War and asked, "Why do you think it was called cold?" I raised my hand and said, "Because they never turned up the heat on their arguments?" The class laughed, but Mr. Benson just stared at me. "Creative, but no," he said. "Anyone else?" I shrugged and whispered to my friend, "Pretty sure it's because no one wanted to pay the heating bill." That turned into an inside joke for weeks, with classmates sneaking in heating bill references during every lecture. Mr. Benson eventually caught on and started calling it the frozen dispute, just to play along. Story 46. In 10th grade, Mr. Harris, our physics teacher, was explaining the concept of terminal velocity. He asked, "Can anyone give me an example of something reaching terminal velocity?" I raised my hand and said, "Yeah, my grades after midterms." The class erupted in laughter, but Mr. Harris didn't miss a beat. "Well, let's hope they don't crash into rock bottom," he shot back. I grinned and replied, "That's why I'm here, learning about gravity. It's my fallback plan." He shook his head but smiled, and for the rest of the semester, terminal velocity became our inside joke about bad test scores. Story 47. Mrs. Dalton, my literature teacher, was famous for her overly dramatic readings. One day, she called on me to read a passage from Wuthering Heights. I decided to really go for it, using a fake British accent and throwing in way too much emotion. By the time I finished, the class was laughing so hard some people had tears in their eyes. Mrs. Dalton stared at me for a moment and said, "Well, that's one way to channel your inner Heathcliff." I shrugged and replied, "Just trying to match your energy, Mrs. Dalton." She sighed, but let me keep reading, and every line I delivered got more and more ridiculous. Edit. At the end of class, Mrs. Dalton handed me a note that read, "You'd make a great actor, but please don't quit your day job yet." Fair enough. Story 48. In middle school, we had a geography teacher, Mr. Willis, who loved pop quizzes. One day, he asked, "What's the most populated city in the world?" I raised my hand and said, "The cafeteria during lunch." The class laughed, but Mr. Willis just gave me a blank stare. "Close," he said, "but I was thinking of Tokyo." I nodded and added, "Tokyo's probably got better food, though." That got another laugh, and from then on, Mr. Willis would preface every question to me with, "And no cafeteria jokes, please." Story 49. In history class, Mr. Carter was explaining the Industrial Revolution and asked, "What do you think was the most important invention of that era?" When no one answered, he looked at me. I said, "The snooze button on the alarm clock, except they were probably too busy working to use it." The class chuckled, and Mr. Carter smirked. "I don't think the snooze button existed back then," he said. "Exactly," I replied. "That's why they needed a revolution." He shook his head, but couldn't hide his smile, and the next quiz actually included a question about alarm clocks, just to mess with me. Story 50. In high school, Mrs. Grant, my biology teacher, had a rule: no eating in class, ever. One day, she caught me sneaking a snack during a lecture on digestion. "Really?" she said. "During this lesson?" I looked at her and said, "I'm just trying to provide a real-time demonstration." The class burst out laughing, but Mrs. Grant wasn't amused. "Fine," she said. "You can demonstrate by explaining the digestive process to the class." I stood up and said, "Step 1, get caught eating. Step 2, embarrass yourself in front of everyone. Step 3, digest your humiliation." Edit. Mrs. Grant actually laughed, which was rare. She even let me finish my snack as long as I promised to stay quiet. I call that a win. Story 51. In 9th grade, my math teacher, Mr. Walker, had a reputation for being strict but fair. One day, he handed out a test with a bonus question. If you could be any number, what would you be and why? Most of the class wrote serious answers, but I decided to have some fun with it. I wrote 0 because it's mysterious, it's nothing, but it can change everything when added to another number. When he handed back the tests, he stopped at my desk and said, "I didn't know we had a philosopher in the class." I shrugged and said, "Math and philosophy are pretty much the same thing, right?" He smiled and walked away. I think I got the bonus points purely for creativity. Story 52. Our gym teacher, Coach Miller, decided to host a fitness challenge to motivate us. He said, "Whoever can do the most push-ups wins a prize." When it was my turn, I did exactly one push-up, stood up and said, "I'm conserving energy for my brain. It's where I'm strongest." The class burst out laughing, but Coach Miller just shook his head. "You know, you're the kind of person who wins participation trophies," he said. I grinned and replied, "I prefer to call them energy conservation awards." By the end of class, energy conservation became our new excuse for slacking off. Story 53. In English class, Mrs. Harper asked us to write a one-page essay on what motivates us. When she called on me to read mine, I said, "What motivates me is the fear of failure. Not just regular failure, but the kind that haunts you in the shower 10 years later." The class laughed, and Mrs. Harper raised an eyebrow. "Interesting perspective," she said. "What about positive motivation?" I shrugged and said, "I'll let you know if I ever find some." She handed me back my essay with a note that said, "Funny, but try to dig a little deeper next time." I still got an A, though. Story 54. In science class, Mr. Doyle was explaining photosynthesis and asked, "Why is sunlight important for plants?" He looked at me and said, "Care to explain?" I replied, "Sure. It's like their morning coffee. They can't function without it." The class laughed, but Mr. Doyle sighed and said, "That's not exactly scientific, but I'll take it." I added, "Hey, if coffee is good enough for humans, it's good enough for plants." After that, every time he mentioned photosynthesis, someone in class would whisper, "Plant coffee," and we'd all crack up. Story 55. Mrs. Thompson, our history teacher, was lecturing about the Renaissance and asked, "What do you think made this period so revolutionary?" I raised my hand and said, "They finally realized life wasn't all about plagues and bad hygiene." The class laughed, but Mrs. Thompson looked unimpressed. "And what else?" she asked. I added, "Oh, and art. Lots of art, like, look, we're not dying anymore, so let's paint everything." She sighed and said, "Creative interpretation, but not exactly what I was looking for." Edit. At the end of class, she came over and said, "You might not be wrong about the plague part. Next time try mixing humor with a little more detail." She even suggested I join the debate team because you clearly enjoy arguing your point. I might have signed up just to see if I could make historical jokes there too. Story 56. In 8th grade, our geography teacher, Mr. Thomas, loved starting class with trivia. One day he asked, "What's the only country in the world that spans 2 continents?" I raised my hand and said, "Turkey, but not the Thanksgiving kind." The class burst out laughing, and Mr. Thomas shook his head. "Yes, Turkey," he said, "but maybe next time, leave the commentary out." I replied, "The commentary makes it memorable." Later that week, he gave us a pop quiz, and one of the questions was about Turkey. Half the class wrote, "Not the Thanksgiving kind," as part of their answers. Mr. Thomas just sighed when he handed the quizzes back. Story 57. My high school English teacher, Mrs. Ellis, had us analyze of mice and men, and asked, "What do you think George's decision at the end says about friendship?" I raised my hand and said, "That sometimes your best friend is also your biggest problem." The class laughed nervously, but Mrs. Ellis wasn't amused. "Care to elaborate?" she asked. I added, "Well, George loved Lenny, but let's be real. Lenny was a walking disaster." She frowned and said, "While that's blunt, it's not entirely wrong." From that day on, she called on me anytime she wanted an unfiltered opinion, which sometimes worked out and sometimes got me in trouble. Story 58. In gym class, Coach Parker loved setting up obstacle courses. One day he announced, "Whoever finishes this the fastest gets extra credit." When it was my turn, I tripped over a hurdle, knocked down a cone, and barely crawled to the finish line. As everyone laughed, I said, "Well, I think we all learned something today. I'm better at dodging gym than doing it." Coach Parker smirked and said, "Extra credit for comedy, maybe." For the rest of the semester, any time I lagged behind in an activity, someone would yell, "Careful! Don't trip over another cone!" Story 59. In science class, Mr. Green was explaining the periodic table and asked, "Who knows the most abundant element in the universe?" I raised my hand and said, "Is it stupidity?" The class erupted, but Mr. Green just shook his head and said, "Close, but it's actually hydrogen." I grinned and replied, "Same thing when you think about it. Both are everywhere." He smirked and said, "Clever, but stick to chemistry next time." By the end of the lesson, the class was calling hydrogen the stupid element, and Mr. Green finally had to say, "All right, enough jokes. Hydrogen deserves more respect." Story 60. Mrs. Harper, our history teacher, was giving a lecture about medieval Europe and said, "Imagine living without electricity, running water, or modern medicine." I raised my hand and said, "So, basically like camping, but with fewer s'mores?" The class laughed, but Mrs. Harper gave me a look. "Camping didn't involve serfs and plagues," she said dryly. I shrugged and replied, "Depends on your campsite." She sighed and moved on, but a week later, we had a group project on medieval living, and someone in my group made a diagram labeled "The Original Camping Trip." Edit, Mrs. Harper actually gave our group extra points for creativity. She admitted later, "I didn't want to laugh, but it was too clever not to." I think that was the closest thing to a compliment I ever got from her. Story 61. In high school, our chemistry teacher, Mr. Lane, loved his demonstrations. One day, he was showing us how magnesium burns brightly and said, "Be careful, it's extremely reactive." As he lit it up, I blurted out, "Kind of like my mom when I leave dishes in the sink." The class burst out laughing, and even Mr. Lane cracked a smile before regaining his serious teacher face. "Let's try to focus on the science," he said. but you could tell he was amused. From then on, anytime we worked with reactive elements, someone in class would whisper, "Don't forget the dishes." Story 62. Mrs. Clayton, our literature teacher, loved assigning essays about themes. One day, she asked us to write about the theme of family in To Kill a Mockingbird. When she read mine, she stopped and asked, "You compared Atticus to a therapist. Care to explain?" I said, "Sure. He listens to everyone's problems, gives advice, and probably doesn't get paid enough." The class laughed, and Mrs. Clayton shook her head. "That's an interesting take," she said. "But maybe next time, focus on the book's context." I replied, "I'm just saying, Atticus deserves a raise." She gave me a B+ with a note that said, "Points for originality, but stick to literary analysis." Story 63. Our gym teacher, Coach Morgan, decided to make us play ultimate frisbee, even though no one had any clue how to play. He shouted, "Just throw it to someone on your team." When the frisbee came my way, I froze and then chucked it in the opposite direction. He blew his whistle and yelled, "What was that?" I said, "A strategic miscalculation." The class burst out laughing, and Coach Morgan rolled his eyes. "Well, your strategy just cost your team a point," he said. For the rest of the semester, strategic miscalculation became our excuse for every failed play in gym class. Story 64. In biology class, Mr. Brooks was lecturing about the human circulatory system. He asked, "Why is the heart so important?" I raised my hand and said, "Because without it, love songs wouldn't exist." The class cracked up, but Mr. Brooks just gave me a deadpan look. I was going for pumping blood, but sure, let's go with that, he said. I grinned and replied, "Both are vital for survival." Later, during a test, he included a bonus question. Name 2 reasons why the heart is important. Naturally, I wrote, circulating blood and inspiring love songs. He wrote back, half credit. Story 65. Mrs. Grant, our history teacher, was talking about the Cold War and said, "Imagine living in constant fear of a nuclear attack." I raised my hand and said, "Isn't that just like every Monday morning before a math test?" The class laughed, and Mrs. Grant tried to stay serious, but eventually smiled. "I suppose there's a similarity in the stress levels," she admitted. Later, during a group project about the Cold War, someone titled our presentation, "The Monday Morning of History." Edit. Mrs. Grant actually laughed when she saw the title and said, "Fine, I'll give you points for creativity, but don't push it." We got an A, and now every stressful moment in school is referred to as a Monday morning Cold War. Story 66. In 9th grade, Mr. Dalton, our biology teacher, had us dissecting frogs one day. He gave a long speech about respecting the specimens and taking the assignment seriously. When he walked by my table, I was poking the frog's leg and muttered to my partner, "What if it twitches back?" Mr. Dalton raised an eyebrow and said, "It won't. This is science, not a horror movie." I couldn't resist replying, "You say that now, but if this lab turns into Jurassic Park, don't say I didn't warn you." The class laughed and Mr. Dalton sighed. "Just focus on the dissection," he said, but he was definitely trying not to smile. Story 67. In English class, Mrs. Peterson asked us to write a poem about something we loved. When it was my turn to read mine, I stood up and said, "This poem is called Ode to Sleep." The entire class giggled as I read, "Oh, sleep, how I cherish thee. You leave me each morning so cruelly." By the time I finished, even Mrs. Peterson was laughing. She said, "Not exactly what I had in mind, but points for originality." I said, "Hey, we were told to write about love. I didn't realize it had to be romantic." She gave me a B and added a note. "Next time, try loving something less. Horizontal." Story 68. Mr. Collins, our geography teacher, was lecturing about tectonic plates and earthquakes. He asked, "Why do tectonic plates move?" I raised my hand and said, "Because they're under a lot of pressure." The class laughed, and Mr. Collins said, "That's technically correct, but not what I was looking for." I replied, "Well, I'm technically under a lot of pressure too, but no one's explaining why I move the way I do." He rolled his eyes and said, "Let's stick to geology." For the rest of the semester, anytime someone was stressed, we joked that they were having a tectonic shift. 69. In gym class, Coach Miller had us doing relay races. My team was losing badly, so when it was my turn, I yelled, "We may not be fast, but we're funny," and jogged to the finish line, waving dramatically like I was in a parade. The entire class cracked up, but Coach Miller wasn't as amused. "You know this is supposed to be a race, right?" he said. I shrugged and replied, "It's all about the journey, not the destination." He sighed and said, "Well, your journey just cost your team the race." But after that, everyone on my team started calling themselves Team Funny, and we made losing into an art form. Story 70. Mrs. Carter, our history teacher, was talking about the Renaissance and asked, "What do you think was the most important invention of this period?" I raised my hand and said, "Glasses. Without them, half the artists wouldn't have seen what they were painting." The class laughed, and Mrs. Carter said, "That's not wrong, but I was thinking of the printing press." I replied, "Fair, but try reading a book without glasses if you're nearsighted." She sighed and said, "You have a point, but you're still getting a quiz on the printing press tomorrow." Eat it. After the quiz, Mrs. Carter handed mine back with a note. "Impressive. Did glasses help you ace this?" I wrote back, "Definitely. Thank you, Renaissance inventors." She laughed and said, "I'll give you bonus points for staying consistent." Story 71. In 10th grade, my chemistry teacher, Mr. Hayes, was explaining the concept of catalysts. He asked, "Can anyone give me an example of a catalyst in real life?" I raised my hand and said, "Sure. My mom yelling 'dinner's ready' instantly gets everyone in my house moving." The class burst out laughing, and Mr. Hayes shook his head. "Well, you're not wrong," he said. Then he added, "Can you think of a chemical example?" I replied, "Is caffeine a chemical? Because it definitely catalyzes my mornings." He sighed and said, "Let's stick to the textbook." For the rest of the week, Mom's dinner yell became our go-to example for everything in class. Story 72. In English class, Mrs. Taylor had us analyzing Romeo and Juliet. She asked, "Why do you think Romeo fell in love with Juliet so quickly?" I raised my hand and said, "Probably because he wasn't thinking straight. He hadn't eaten or slept in days." The class laughed, and Mrs. Taylor frowned. "Do you have a serious answer?" she asked. I shrugged and replied, "Love at first sight isn't logical. It's more like the Renaissance version of bad Wi-Fi. It just happens out of nowhere." She sighed but gave me a smile. On the next quiz, the question about Romeo's impulsiveness came with a note. "No Wi-Fi jokes this time." Story 73. Our gym teacher, Coach Sanders, decided to mix things up with a yoga session. He told us, "Yoga is about focus and balance. Let's see how good yours is." When it was my turn to try a tree pose, I wobbled, fell, and said, "Clearly, my roots aren't strong today." The class cracked up, and Coach Sanders said, "Well, maybe next time, water them before class." For the rest of the period, every time someone struggled with a pose, someone else would yell, "Water your roots." Coach eventually gave up and joined in on the joke, saying, "You're all a forest of chaos." Story 74. In history class, Mr. Green was discussing the Great Depression and said, "Imagine living in a time when jobs were scarce and money was even scarcer." I raised my hand and said, "Sounds like every summer when my parents make me babysit for free." The class laughed, and Mr. Green smirked. "Well, at least you're not facing breadlines," he said. I replied, "True, but I am facing snack time negotiations with toddlers. It's close enough." From then on, summer babysitting became our unofficial comparison for any historical hardship. Edit. A few weeks later, Mr. Green assigned us a project on family life during the Depression. He added a special note to mine. "Great work, but I hope your babysitting gigs don't make it into future textbooks." I guess my humor stuck with him. Story 75. Mrs. Carter, our biology teacher, was lecturing about the nervous system and said, "The brain is responsible for every decision you make." I raised my hand and said, "So, when I eat ice cream at midnight, I should blame my brain?" The class laughed, and Mrs. Carter smirked. "Yes, but don't forget your taste buds. They're in on it too," she said. I added, "So it's a conspiracy then? Great, now I have trust issues with my own body." She chuckled and said, "Trust issues or not, let's focus on the neurons." Later, someone in class made a meme about midnight brain conspiracies, and it became a running joke for the rest of the semester. Story 76. In 8th grade, Mr. Johnson, our history teacher, was explaining the concept of manifest destiny and how it justified westward expansion. He asked, "Why do you think people believed they had the right to take over new land?" I raised my hand and said, "Because no one invented the phrase, 'stay in your lane,' yet." The class burst out laughing, and Mr. Johnson tried to keep a straight face, but couldn't. "That's one way to put it," he said. Later, during a quiz, one of the questions asked about the reasoning behind manifest destiny. Naturally, I wrote, "They didn't know how to stay in their lane." He gave me partial credit with a note that said, "Next time, explain it with less sass." Story 77. In gym class, Coach Reed decided to test our endurance with a series of sprints. After the third lap, I stopped mid-run and yelled, "Isn't running just walking aggressively?" The class cracked up, and Coach Reed blew his whistle. "Running is a life skill," he said. I shouted back, "So is pacing yourself, and I'm doing great at that." For the rest of the week, anytime someone got tired during gym, they'd yell, "I'm just aggressively walking." Even Coach Reed started using it as a joke when someone slowed down during laps. Story 78. In biology class, Mr. Evans was lecturing on the food chain. He asked, "What's at the top of the food chain?" I raised my hand and said, "My mom's lasagna. Nothing beats it." The class laughed and Mr. Evans smirked. "That's not exactly what I meant, but I'll allow it." Then I added, "Actually, humans are at the top because we invented forks. That's an unbeatable advantage." He rolled his eyes but let it slide. Later, during a test, one of the questions asked about adaptations that put humans at the top of the food chain. I wrote, "Opposable thumbs and the invention of forks." Mr. Evans wrote back, "Correct, but I can't believe you actually wrote that." Story 79. Mrs. Carter, our English teacher, was explaining irony and asked, "Who can give me an example?" I raised my hand and said, "Doing all the homework, but forgetting to bring it to class." The class nodded in agreement, and Mrs. Carter smiled. "That's relatable, but can anyone think of a literary example?" I added, "Romeo and Juliet, dying for love when a text message could have saved the day." The class burst out laughing, and Mrs. Carter said, "You're not wrong, but let's stick to the text." For the rest of the semester, "should have texted" became our unofficial summary for every Shakespeare tragedy. Edit. During finals, one of the essay prompts asked how technology could change Shakespearean plots. Mrs. Carter wrote on my paper, "Great points, but now I can't stop thinking about Romeo saying, 'New phone, who dis?'" I think that was her way of admitting my joke stuck with her. Story 80. In chemistry, Mr. Brooks was demonstrating how different elements react when exposed to heat. He set up a Bunsen burner and said, "Let's see what happens when we heat magnesium." I whispered to my lab partner, "Probably a better reaction than I get when I try to tell jokes at home." Unfortunately, Mr. Brooks heard me. "Care to repeat that for the class?" he asked. I shrugged and said, "Sure. I said magnesium has better chemistry than me at family dinner." The entire class burst into laughter, and Mr. Brooks sighed. "Let's focus on the reaction," he said, but I caught him chuckling as he turned back to the experiment. For the rest of the semester, every time something didn't react during a lab, someone would yell, "Looks like it's got family dinner energy."